Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening everywhere. Everywhere you are watching us from. On behalf of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and the Water Policy Center, it gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, chair, and participants who have joined this session. To chair this session, we have Mr. Manish Dabade with us today. It is my great pleasure to introduce this chair. Mr. Manish Dabade is an assistant professor, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. He is currently an assistant professor in diplomacy. His research interests include international security issues with a special focus on great power security strategies in the post-Cold War era and nuclear security in Southern Asia. He teaches MPhil courses on international negotiation theory and practice and contemporary issues in international security and an MA course on superpower diplomacy. He is an alumni of JNU New Delhi. Currently, he is researching on his doctoral dissertation on India's nuclear diplomacy after Pokhran II, 1998 and 1998-2005. Without extending further, let me request Mr. Manish Sabade to take charge of this session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
And on behalf of NIICE and Water Policy Center, I welcome you all today to session number 26. I think this has been a fantastic, time for all scholars all over the world. And thanks to Zoom, it has become possible to really host all of you today with us. And looking at the list of speakers we have in this session, all very scholarly names I can see, and obviously speaking on very important topics. For example, we have, on post-pandemic or post-COVID politics, new features and concerns, a role of international tax reform in financing COVID response. Uh, then you have the quest for new world order in the post-pandemic times, and the future of India's sub-regionalism, connecting the missing links. So these are extremely important topics and extremely important conversations we should be tuning in into. So without further ado, I now request Dr. Noshin Wasi, who is an assistant professor, Department of International Relations, University of Karachi, Pakistan, and she is going to speak to us today on post-COVID-19 politics, new features and concerns. So over to you, Noshin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to express my thanks first of all to NIICE and WPC for inviting me to be part of this very esteemed webinar. And I congratulate the organizers on the successful completion of this seminar. This is the last day, and I hope that is going to vibrate for a longer period of time. You see, like any transition period, there are always in transition, there are more questions than answers. And we tend to comment on day-to-day happenings. But 8 months down the road, I would like to take the conceptual framework to deal with the change that is taking place, and specifically in the field of politics. Like every transitory moment, there are trepidations. The same was with the COVID-19 politics, and hope at the same time. They are ahead, and what we could on a stone, there are always chances that we can form a better future. So let me begin with the hope factor first. Given the factors what led to this pandemic in mind, for example, the environment degradation, you see population growth, rampant urbanization, global warming, and the immediate fallout of lockdown that was enforced to make social distancing possible. That was the only viable solution in front of the absence of vaccine to deal with this virus, um, in the presence of social inequalities, when this lockdown was introduced, you see, scholars began to argue the structural weaknesses in the global political system. And scholars began to argue that this pandemic will lead to changes that will ensure better future for the larger population of the world. Specifically, scholars seemed to agree on three powerful shifts in order to find mechanisms to reshape a world order. Those possible shifts were from state to human security that we have been arguing for long, since 80s, that has been the matter of debate. Then we talked about uh, scholars think that there might be a shift from greed-driven capitalism to conscience-laced capitalism, and finally from US Eurocentric global politics to an Asia-centric order. Besides, there were predictions of peripheral changes within the domestic power structure of states in light of the crisis that we saw. However, people like me were still cautious to jump into the bandwagon of analysis. And reasons for this caution was history. If history is to tell us anything, you see, and if we are to take lessons from history, this pandemic was anything but unpredictable. My assumption is that it was very predictable since the outbreak of SARS in 2002. Numerous research articles, policy papers were issuing dire warnings that a global pandemic involving a new respiratory disease was inevitable. There were many warnings issued to the governments of the world to take measures of it. There was a mock exercise, contagion exercise, that gave United States warning that a pandemic like this is in picture. However, mounting evidences of dire impact of climate change, environment degradation, and pandemic were ignored. Rather, considerations of strategic and military security and the new liberal fixation with profit maximization overwhelmed and sidelined the agenda that highlighted the interrelated nature of human security. Even after the pandemic, we hardly see rational responses from the major power structures, from the major power centers where the mature response should have come. The United States failed miserably to provide the world's leadership. And you see, change in international politics has always been evolutionary and reactive to political happenings. We have read about the 1918 pandemic as well. That pandemic did not change the world, but the World War II discourse did. And in the same way, I do not see COVID-19 leading to any major political change. Yes, it has introduced to a new set of rules to governance, to govern the state of affairs in all spheres of life. And I would say adding to the already existing divides, and it's leading to more polarization. And here is the real problem lies, that I see the matter of concerns. This pandemic has introduced to a new set of problems, and there seems no mature response to deal with that crisis. Say only white collar professions have shifted their work online. Much requires to be on ground. It's happening on ground, and it is hitting the rest less privileged harder. On global politics, though, there are adjustments. I didn't see any major change. For example, the territorial states will remain the basic building block. There has been retreat from globalization that was in debate for a longer period of time. I see more nationalist feelings will surge, and they will remain powerful. Major powers will continue to compete. However, I do not see a major war in picture in the coming year because of the interests and stake United States and China have in their mutual relationship. So there is more likely that already existing division will be reinforced, and they might lead to the intra-state wars, intra-states war in a fashion, in a way that are difficult to deal with. You see, we are seeing the crisis of this black politics in America right now. And in many other states, because scores of people got unemployed, uh, the reasons for their plight is being put on the people, that is creating the racial devices, that is creating the ethnic divides in these states, and these divisions are being exploited by the power centers. And you see, much of the political discourse is taking online. The grassroots, at the grassroots level, people are disintegrated and they are disoriented. And this is creating to the local miseries in different states, specifically in the developing countries, but developed states are not exemptions as well. So what I see in the coming years in the political scenario, I see more division, I see more deprivation, underdevelopment in the states, and the acute leadership crisis that is going to create more problems. Then another worrying factor is that there is another wave of pandemic is in picture. And you see, we have not dealt with the crisis as yet. The world is not settled. There are still more questions, confusions. So how we are going to deal with the second wave of the pandemic? What would be the responses from the major powers of the world? What the if the politics aggravate at the global level, which is likely because major power competition is there, new alliances are in form, and states may take advantage of that situation, because you see, even the military escalations are not out of the picture. We saw this China India power political show. So in the region, and then the, you see, regional cooperation mechanisms have not be up to the expectations. So the older divides are there in picture. My submission is that this political system will remain the same with few peripheral changes, and there is lot more challenging that we need to deal with. And the unfortunate and worrisome factor is that I do not see leadership in any of our states mature enough to deal with that crisis. So although the hope factor is high, and people are talking about it at the greater level in the longer run, but I do not see any major change taking place. Rather, I see there are certain factors aggravating the already divides present in the global power structures and the local power structures, and that is going to create more problems. So you see, all the problems related to the exclusive and inclusive nature of security is not being taken into account the way they should have been. So we see the more difficult times ahead, and it is high time that we shun our differences in region at regional level, and you see, come up with the concrete policies that help us fight the challenges of the time. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting, a very insightful presentation. Obviously, you started with the singular focus away, or anyone would like to move from state to human security. I think that's a very valid sort of point you're making. Very important submission. Very important point was that we have this whole move towards, or the idea to move towards the Asia-centric order. I think it's equally important point you have made. Again, looking at, about talking about the pandemic, that, there were earlier lessons of history which we all need to draw upon. Very important point. And obviously, you beautifully painted out the real picture. In fact, as a realist, I would be very happy. I was very happy listening to that, ultimately great power. In fact, that is what I was also speaking today morning, that really great power politics matters, and states are still stuck in that. Despite the pandemic, rather than coming together, states are still stuck in sort of a competitive sort of realist still looking at realist lens, and are still not able to understand the nature of the pandemic, the tremendous challenge it is posing to human security. I think that is where we all should be agreeing that ultimately states, despite their whatever realist concerns, at least in this domain, should be coming together and joining hands for the sake of humanity. Thank you. I think I really enjoyed listening to this. So with this, we move to the next presentation. Okay, this is now we have Abdul Mohit Chaudhary, who is the Senior Program Officer, South Center, Switzerland, and he is going to speak today on role of international tax reform in financing COVID-19 response. So over to you, Mohit.
Thank you, Manish. It's nice to meet everyone and my South Asian colleagues here. The South Center is an intergovernmental organization which was created to work on economic issues of interest to developing countries. And we have a South Center tax initiative which specifically looks at international tax cooperation. So we help developing countries in international tax negotiations. So it's a niche topic, but it involves a lot of money for developing countries to raise. So in this presentation, I want to take everyone through what are some of the key issues which are being discussed and why this is important in helping developing countries finance the post-COVID recovery. So I'm going to start my presentation. I'll share my screen. The first point to be made is that revenue from taxation, domestically collected revenue, is going to become the main source for governments to build hospitals, get ventilators, carry out public works to re-stimulate the economy, and all of those things through which the economic cycle can be restarted once the pandemic begins to peter out. Governments will find it very difficult to get this money from abroad. So here, there are three charts over here. This chart looks at incoming foreign direct investment flows. So this is from 2015. We see it's been continuously declining. 2018, it kind of repeated, and 2019, when the global economic cycle began to reach the end, because as we know, a recession comes every 10 years. So since 2008, we were en route to a recession anyway in 2019 or 2020. So we see FDI flows beginning to really stagnate, and then 2019 onwards, they really declined. And the COVID pandemic has accelerated that trend, and we can expect this to worsen actually. And hopefully in 2021, by then, if a vaccine is found or we find some other way to deal with the pandemic, then we can begin to see the economy, the global economy, begin to limp back to normal and FDI flows coming after that. But the point here is that until then, we cannot really expect, especially the developing countries cannot really expect much of foreign direct investment flows to come into their economies and facilitate economic activity. The second chart over here, I mean, the years are not mentioned, but the years are not displaying, but this is actually revenue from tariffs, customs revenue, essentially tariffs on imports and exports in some cases. So we see here that since this starts in 2002, so from 2002 onwards, there is a continuous decline in tariff revenue, in part because of free trade negotiations, which have continuously driven down the tariff rate in most countries. There is a steady decline in the amount of money governments are able to collect from customs, and it increased temporarily, I think, in 2017, but the overall trend is negative. This stops at 2018. So, and now after the pandemic, international trade has really declined. So we see that even money from customs is something which is declining for countries, especially developing countries, which are to a large extent exporters of primary commodities. Countries which are dependent on aid, least developed countries mostly, are also seeing reduced money in aid from the developed country counterparts. So these are three different types of aid. The colors, but they all refer to different types of aid which are being received. And again, the trend is negative. We see that aid flows are also declining. Though it's interesting to see that the red line over here which is linked to capital formation or investment, in other words, is sort of has remained stable after the Belt and Road Initiative. But in any case, that is also a source which has been declining. So the key point here is that money from outside is going to reduce, and developing countries will have to focus on being more effective at collecting taxes to get the money they need to finance the COVID response. Now, let's look at some numbers on how much money is lost because of tax avoidance so that we know how much money can be collected. And if you see, the money is really quite a lot. So one estimate, this comes from the IMF and from this other agency called the Tax Justice Network. It pegs the limit at around $500 to $650 billion every year lost globally because of corporate tax avoidance. So that's a huge amount of money which can be used, especially by the developing countries, to carry out the kind of work needed to finance the post-COVID recovery. In our countries, there is a lot of talk about politicians putting their money in Swiss bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and these kind of countries in the tax havens. And estimates again range from $7 to $32 trillion of private wealth, which is held in these tax havens. So if this is taxed, we can really expect a significant amount of money. Even a 1% of this would be a huge amount of money, actually. This chart shows some of the biggest tax havens in the world, and we see that they are mostly Western countries, Netherlands. Most of them are actually parts of the United Kingdom. Bermuda, Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands are all either overseas territories or crown dependencies of the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom cumulatively is actually the world's biggest tax haven. So these countries are really contributing to the illicit financial flows from the developing world. So there is, again, the key point from this is that there is a lot of money which can be taxed by the developing countries, even now in the COVID situation. But obviously, this would apply to some sectors more than the other sectors. And here, the real winner from the COVID pandemic has been the digital company, the digitalized businesses, the tech companies. As all of us are having this webinar on Zoom, we would have been talking to each other face to face. Otherwise, we can really see that after the COVID pandemic, Amazon has had a 34% increase in revenue, Apple has 6%, Alphabet, which is the company that owns Google, has had a 6%, Microsoft has seen a 14% rise. So these tech giants have really seen a huge increase in their revenues, while many other businesses are struggling and some of them are even dying. So this is the real target. We, the developing countries, have to focus on how can we tax these tech companies more effectively on the profits that they are making during this pandemic period. The pandemic, as is obvious, has created rising demand for digital goods and services. Another point is that now, because many small businesses and medium-sized enterprises are unable to effectively survive in this difficult environment, they're being bought over by these big companies. So there's also a rise in mergers and acquisitions by these already enormous companies. So these might become even more powerful. There might be some tech sector consolidation actually during the pandemic. So it's more important to tax their profits effectively to prevent oligopolistic concerns. How do these companies make money? Because this is something not everybody is very clear with. So I thought I'd give a couple of examples. So Alphabet, again, which is a parent company that owns Google, earns 70% of its revenue from advertising. And for Facebook, we see that's 98.5%. So advertising is really one of the biggest sources of income for these companies. And then there are other sources through where they sell their apps and music and other things from which they make money. But it's really advertising actually, which is bringing in the money. So a little bit of introduction to international taxation. So under the rules of international tax, okay, so the first thing is that if a country wants to tax a foreign MNC, let's say that Facebook is selling ads to Nepal, to consumers in Nepal or to businesses in Nepal. And Facebook is headquartered, its parent jurisdiction is in the United States. So this question of whether the profits have to be taxed in the United States or in Nepal will be governed by a bilateral agreement, which is called a double taxation agreement. And this is how international tax is governed. It's on the basis of bilateral double taxation avoidance agreements, which distribute the taxing rights between both countries. And the country from where the investment or the company is coming in, that is usually called the resident company, because the investor is resident as a tax resident of that jurisdiction. And the country where the revenue is being earned is called the source country, because that is a source of income. And these distribution of taxing rights are on the basis of model conventions. And these model conventions are made by the United Nations and by the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, an intergovernmental organization of 35 of the world's richest countries, mostly in Europe. So both the model conventions of the UN and the OECD say that under Article 7, the profits of the non-resident, So in this case, if Facebook is a resident of the United States and it's selling advertisements in Nepal, the profits of Facebook, the non-resident, would be taxable in the state of residence, which would be the United States, unless it has what is called a permanent establishment in the source country. So basically, if Facebook has no physical presence in Nepal, its profits would be taxed in the United States. Or more generally, for the country where the profits are being earned, they can be taxed only if the foreign company has a physical presence over there. Now, this physical presence requirement has become a big problem when it comes to the digital company, because these companies can just set up a website or create an app, and through that they can sell their digital services anywhere in the world. They don't need to go to another country and set up an office over there. So because of these existing international tax rules, MNCs are able to really avoid their contribution of taxes to the country from which they're making profits, which has all kinds of problems, because if a domestic company is paying taxes on its income, then why should a foreign company not pay? And then there are other arguments as well, because as a foreign company, you're also being provided safety by the police, services of the judiciary, many public services for which you need to also contribute in terms of rent. From an economic perspective, there's a rent argument as well. So the basic point is that under international tax rules, physical presence is necessary to tax a foreign company. This gives rise to what is called taxable presence, also known as nexus. And once there is nexus, then profits would be attributed to that subsidiary or the permanent establishment, and then those profits would then be taxed. In some countries, even where there is a permanent establishment, like in the case of India, Facebook or Amazon, they do have physical offices, but then these offices are structured in such a way that as little as possible of profits are attributed to that permanent establishment. And this is done through a process called transfer pricing, and which I won't get into because it's beyond the scope of this presentation. But transfer pricing is used to attribute how much of profits of a global multinational is given to the specific subsidiary in a particular country. And in the digital economy, which is largely based on software, this gives rise to some very technical challenges, where especially in developing countries, the tax officials find it very difficult to assess whether the profit attribution has been correctly done. So in short, the existing rules of international tax make it difficult to tax the profits of the digitalized companies, which are currently the main winners from the pandemic situation, so to speak. Now, there are some discussions on how do we reform these rules. These discussions are taking place, as mentioned, in the OECD and in the United Nations, the two key organizations where these rules are made. So within the OECD, in 2015, the G20 and the OECD had created this institution called the Inclusive Framework, which is a body of 137 jurisdictions, not member states, which are negotiating updates to these international tax rules, which we have just discussed. And it is called it has been called a two-pillar approach. So pillar one, this is a part of pillar one, seeks to update these international tax rules. And pillar two essentially seeks to put in place a global minimum corporate tax rate so that every MNC pays a minimum amount of money in every country where it's active. The details of this proposal, again, are beyond the scope of this presentation, but suffice to say that the OECD's proposal is extremely, extremely complicated. Even developed countries are expressing their doubts at whether they would be able to implement such a complex proposal. And the structure of it is such that the OECD's own revenue estimates say that most of it will go to the developed countries. Most of the new tax revenue which will be collected will actually go to the developed countries, and very little will come to the developing countries. So this is really a negotiation, and the same applies for the second pillar, which is structurally towards the interest of the developed countries. So at least within the OECD, which in any case is called a club of the rich, the tax discussions are so far going towards the developed countries, not towards the developing countries. However, in the UN, the discussion is slightly more positive. So the UN has come out recently with a draft proposal which seeks to update the UN Model Convention by introducing a new Article 12B. This would essentially tax income from automated digital services. So what that means is, tomorrow, if I want to subscribe to Netflix, I just need to put in my details and pay the money, and that's it. It's automatically done. I don't need to talk to a human being to do that. Or similarly, if I want to place an advertisement on Facebook, or so if I want to buy a song from Google Music Store or something like that, it's all automatic. I don't need to interact with a human being. So these are what are called automated digital services. And these are really the big chunk of the revenues for the tech giants. So the UN's proposal is to tax the income from automated digital services. It goes beyond the physical presence requirement of existing rules. And it says that these income can be taxed in the source country, which is defined as a country where the payment has been made. So if I mean, I'm an Indian citizen. If I pay money for a Netflix account from India, then that income of Netflix would be taxed in India. So that is the broad structure. So that is very helpful because it reallocates the taxing right towards the source countries, which are also mostly the developing countries. Profit attribution to the a developing or the source country would either be on a gross or a net income basis. What that basically means is there is currently this discussion, which some of you may be familiar with, on digital service taxes, which has been introduced by France recently and UK and many other countries, and there has been some backlash from the United States. So this is in a way structurally similar to the digital service taxes. What it basically says is that the total amount of money from the sales which has been made in a particular country, a certain percentage of that would be taxed. That's what it basically means. So it can be, so the Article 12B says that these these revenues can be taxed either on a gross basis or on a net income basis. And there's a certain formula for calculating what net income would be, which again is much easier than the OECD's proposal for developing countries to implement. And it is also important to note that this proposal has been made entirely by developing countries. The UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters has 25 members, 13 of which are developing countries, and all 13 developing countries got together and made this proposal. So this is really a proposal coming from the global south, from the developing world. So it is still draft, it has not yet become finalized, but let's hope that it does become final, because that would really enable the developing countries to be able to start taxing the profits of these giant multinationals and be able to finance the the COVID recovery. So thank you. And I understand that this was a rather technical presentation, but I'm very happy to take any questions that may come.
Yeah, thanks. I think that was again very an excellent presentation, really laying out for many of us, or maybe me, I really wasn't aware of the international taxation landscape. And I think some very important points, obviously aided by charts. Obviously, I think you had a very valid point that in this current scenario, again triggered by recession, the cash flows from abroad have obviously reduced, and COVID, in fact, has really made it much sharper. And that's exactly why the importance of collecting taxes. Uh, Again, very important point, how tech giants like Amazon, Facebook, what exactly is their revenue model, and I think those were very enlightening. Points. Obviously, the existing rules of taxation very weak, international taxation very weak, and then you talked about the OECD and the UN proposal. So there are some positives in this whole debate, which I think are very important. So yeah, so thank you for that presentation, and now we move to the next speaker, and I'm happy that everyone is sticking to allotted time of 15 plus around 15 minutes. So next is we have with us Dr. Vaishali Raghuvanshi, who is an assistant professor at BHU, and she is going to speak on the quest for new world order in the post-pandemic times. So over to you, Vaishali. Is Vaishali with us?
Can you hear me now, Professor Manish?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
clear.
Thank you
Please
so
go ahead.
much for having me here to share whatever observation I have for the COVID-19 era, I'll call it as. And thank you, Dr. Pramod, for sending the invite. And it is actually quite interesting to see many people from a lot of different geographical locations speaking about their own observation. And what a better time it can be to talk about these things. So before starting the presentation, I would like to share just a small observation, which is that just 7 to 8 months ago, it would have been impossible to foresee the kind of world we are living in. As in, I'm not going much back, just in February or January. We were having our normal lives, and then we were studying, we were observing about the G7 meeting and G20 meetings and all. And then now is the time when we are in this timeline where even major countries are trying to and have actually settled with the virtual conferences. And this is where we are. This has certainly brought the world to a standstill for a good time. And then it has impacted every aspect of human lives, to be it social, political, or economic. And as I have stated, we have also seen the impact of the COVID-19 on this seminar. I'm sure the seminar would have been the same manner, but the subject which we are probing here is actually affecting each and every individual life. So this is what is the importance of the entire theme, which is of this conference, and which is why it attracted my attention that I must see how others are speaking about it. Through this presentation, I would like to delve into the questions regarding the changing world order and the way COVID-19 epidemic would impact it. Certainly, we all are talking about the world order from our own perspective. So we have seen a unipolar world for a very long time where USA's superpower status was challenged by none. And however, it was witnessed in the recent times that the unipolar nature of the world order was being slowly challenged by the rise of China. And we started the discussion about whether it is a period of transition or it is going to be a phase of multilateral, a phase of multipolar world and whatnot. It is in the wake of the Great Power rivalry that we have analyzed what role could COVID-19 will play in the international system, and which was already in flux to highlight here. And in order to understand this, I have tried to interpret various forces that were already at work in recent times, and they were shaping the global order, and they were the part of the major narrative which we have when we talk about international system. And after highlighting these factors, I'll discuss about that a bit about what we saw as the advent of, as an effect of the advent of the COVID-19 and its impact. And finally, we can talk about certain aspects, projections related to the future course in terms of the global order. So if I have to talk about the global world order, which was in discussion before COVID-19 would have been observed as this serious phenomena, we have certain variables to talk about, or I will call it as certain factors which were part of our discussion when we were talking about international system, international order per se. And the very first factor which is in my mind and which many scholars have spoken about has been the rise of nationalist movements. And over the past years, we have seen rising nationalism has become a phenomena which is everywhere and in everything. From the elections of Donald Trump to Brexit, the nationalist policies of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi, and the Turkish President Erdogan. The success of far-right parties in Italian, German, and Australian elections in 2017 and 2018, nationalism appears to be on the rise globally. And we all have seen that there has been rise of nationalist parties and candidates in Europe, as well as in other comparable trends in US, which is quite visible even today. So before we talk about anything else, we need to understand that this trend has also given a kind of analysis to the scholars who were involving themselves with the idea of international order. Now, the second point which comes whenever we talk about the international order in pre-pandemic times has been the rise of protectionism in terms of trade and culture. We all have seen that trade integration has slowed over the last decade. There used to be times when we were talking about, when there were many scholars talking about the process of regional integration, and it has taken a concrete place in the discussion of international relations. And regional integration has provided another level of analysis to the international relations scholars. And as we know, the process of trade integration started after the Second World War. It gained new impetus in 1980s and had a golden age with the rise of US as a hegemon from the 1990 to 2008. when total trade in goods and services increased from 39% to 61% of world GDP. Since then, the trade has slowed post 2008, and we know the reason of financial crisis 2008. And while protectionism has been on the rise, driven by an increase in non-tariff and more recently tariff barriers. At the same time, public support for globalization has also declined on the both sides of the Atlantic. And this has actually contributed to the rise of twist, I will say, a turn in the nature of globalization. And while factors such as Brexit and Euroscepticism have challenged the principle of freedom of movement and economic integration in Europe, the benefits of free trade have been openly called into question in the US and elsewhere. Trade tensions escalated in 2018 as protectionist threats by US administration and retaliatory response by its main trading partners were followed by concrete actions. And the risk of trade war was so visible, and it came sharply into the focus. And from there, we start a discussion, and we have phrased how trade war can be an important factor when we talk about the international order. Now, the data from Global Trade Alert database shows that over the past 3 years, among the largest economies comprising the G20 group, India is the only second behind the Donald Trump-led US in imposing the restrictions on the trade. There is a reason why I'm quoting the example of India here, because even now, in this time, if we will see, India is actually evolving as a key player to me in terms of bringing any analysis to the international order, which is largely shadowed by the great power politics. And I'll deconstruct the reason further in the later part. Now, again, to quote one more survey, which was conducted by the Global Business Alliance, which represents US subsidiaries of groups, including BMW, Nestle, HSBC in Washington. 77% of its members said that they thought the US would become more protectionist on trade positions and government procurements because of the COVID. Now, the idea here is to trace that it was coming from the pre-COVID times, and even during the COVID times, it is being observed that it has actually, COVID times has actually furthered the idea of protectionism. And since the coronavirus pandemic began spreading around the world, many countries, including the US, have been considering measures to crack down on global supply chains, particularly the healthcare sectors. Now we can see that the trade escalation, the tension over the trade matters, which started from the pre-COVID times between the US and China, have actually escalated, escalated. I think I lost the connection. Am I audible now?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Manish, thank you. So I was talking about how the trade war, which started in the pre-COVID times, has actually furthered during the COVID times. Now, the third factor which we have to consider the impact on the international order is actually the rise of anti-globalization forces. Basically, the discussion over the anti-globalization started with the idea of protectionism, and researchers have found that globalization was stagnating, and measures of political, social, and economic connectedness had actually plateaued in many nations. And examples of how it was happening, I have quoted in my previous discussion. Back in 2013, The Economist magazine stated that a new great kind of globalization had overtaken many nations since 2008. And we know that the same gated globalization seemed to return back on the global stage when we talk about the COVID times. And just to refer to what is gated globalization, it includes protecting domestic industries by imposing trade tariffs. It restricts the FDI policies and export subsidies, all in order to strengthen domestic production. And the same trend we can see emerging here when we talk about the COVID times. Now, the last aspect which we can highlight in terms of understanding and analyzing the impact of international order is actually the domination of right wing. All over the Europe, the past few years have seen actually a noticeable growth in xenophobia, particularly in reaction to asylum seekers and immigrants. Simultaneously, there has been a growing rejection of European cooperation, propelling the 2016 vote in favor of Brexit in the UK and the rise of far-right movements all over the continent. We have also seen the same set of events happening in the US. In US, President Donald Trump, whose rise to power was helped by the right-wing populist strategist Steve Bannon, has promoted an anti-immigrant agenda. The American president has not shied away from incendiary remarks, and under his presidency, hate crimes are on the rise. And we can see that hashtag Black Lives Matter even continuing today, which can be linked to basically the historical connections of what kind of movement is happening all over the US. Now, when we talk about our own geographical space in India, meanwhile, voters elected our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has been termed by some as Hindu nationalist in 2014 and then again in 2019. Right-wing populist movements are spreading quickly. Among the world's democracies, a growing number has embraced right-wing populism and either have government led by populist parties or supported by them. Now we can gather from this discussion that the above explained forces were so unfolding in recent times that countries and economies were developing a tendency to be more inward-looking in every aspect of international relations. This would certainly have an impact on post-pandemic world order. So the idea to highlight the factors which were compelling the international order, which was already in transition, was that we can see the mirroring impact of the same during the COVID times, and when we talk about the projections relating to the COVID times. Now, when we see after the advent of COVID, what kind of 2-3 major narratives we have analyzed as IR students, we saw that the major dilemma came over the G7 summit, which was scheduled in June, and it was scrapped due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And after the entire deliberation over the plan of switching the entire meet to a virtual conference, President Donald Trump suggested that it should be done in person in the fall and just before the elections. Second important event which we saw, though we don't talk about sports diplomacy, but it is important here to understand that there is a concrete role of sports as well when we talk about international relations. And we saw that Olympics have been cancelled, and the impact of this has been on IR as well. Now, another important narrative which was highlighted with the advent of COVID was the China-US blame game. To quote here, I'll quote here the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who said that today we are all still wearing masks and watching the pandemic body count rise because the Chinese Communist Party failed in its promises to the world. This was the most prominent example of Trump administration blaming China. And in turn, we saw that China has actually accused US of mismanagement and failure to take the pandemic seriously. Now, no matter how the world order turns out to be, it can be safely assumed that like Great Depression, World Wars, and Spanish flu, COVID-19 has also caused defining changes in the world order. Though it is too early to say that there will be these kind of changes in the post-COVID time, but whatever we are observing, it can be analyzed from that. Now, when we come to the post-COVID predictions or the discussion about the third section of the presentation, which is about the projections which we can have as a post-COVID time, the first point is very clear that the world is not going to do away with the great power rivalry. Like we have seen in the pre-COVID times, we are going to observe the same, which will be the US-China rivalry, which will take the larger backdrop of the entire discussion about how post-COVID, how COVID will define the international order. And it is clear from the discussion on the pre-COVID forces in international system that any changes in the existing world order cannot be devoid of US-China rivalry. It is only the larger backdrop of this rivalry that we will have to consider the changes in the existing world order. And I maintain here that it is going to be the change in nature, but not the entire set of how it is. However, it must be stated at the outset that it would be too early to decide that what will be the changes, if any, in the existing world order. And since the international system is increasingly complex and operates with several players at several levels, in order to simplify the discussion here, I have tried to take two hypotheses. The first hypothesis, what if China reigns supreme and it becomes the superpower? And second hypothesis is that the international isolation of China. Now, to deconstruct these two assumptions, we can take help of four concepts. These four concepts have been elaborated in many research analysis which I was reading for this presentation. And this has actually caught my attention because when we were teaching international relations pre-COVID times, we were trying to understand that how these phenomena, how these processes are going to actually impact the analysis which we do of international system today, because today is the time which is highly impacted by the technology, which is highly impacted by the geopolitics, which is highly impacted by the institutions and economy per se. So I'll first bring the idea of geopolitics. So the four important concepts which I have taken here to deconstruct the hypothesis is actually the geopolitics, multilateralism, geoeconomics, and geotechnology. When we talk about geopolitics, the first thing which comes in our mind is actually what we saw in the pre-COVID times is the demise of Pax Americana. Pax Americana, just to explain it a bit, is the time period in which the US has been the most influential and powerful nation in the world and has led a global system in which the world has been more peaceful than at any other time in its history. Has lasted from the World War II in 1945 to the present day. Even there are scholars talking about this, debating about this timeline, but it can be it can be subject to the arguments and can be subject to the facts and figures which we have. Now what we see is that there is a demise of this concept. And today it appears that the American empire is actually declining or has declined or either in transition. But there are also scholars who are saying that this will disintegrate further when we come to the post-COVID times because of the two important factors which US has brought to the discussion of international order. The first has been the changed perception towards globalization and multilateralism. Now the world is moving towards once we know that US has actually, or the hegemony of US has vouched for the idea of importance of globalization and importance of multilateralism to the international system for the maintenance of peace and security. But now that perception is shifting towards the inward-looking model of the economy. And the second aspect, which is actually contributing to the demise, or which will contribute to the demise of Pax Americana, is actually the USA's abandonment of its role as a global leader. We know that novel coronavirus has become truly a global event. And while its geopolitical implications should be considered secondary to matters of health and safety, those implications may be in long term prove just as consequential, especially when it comes to the United States global position. We talk about, whenever we talk about the vaccine or we talk about the measures which has been taken by the US to prevent the further spread, or be it any sort of discussion over the revival of the economy, we have seen that the entire world was looking for the example of US to follow, but there US has actually failed to set an example to the rest of the world. And there are many interpretations of it. We can debate that, we can discuss that further. And what COVID-19 has shown is that it's probably in a very long time that the world is missing the leadership of US in what can be described as the most trying times since World War II. While on the other hand, when we talk about China, Though there has been allegations for the China for the concealment of virus, but China has tried to actually fill this gap in a very bleak manner by engaging in the diplomacy known as medical diplomacy. We'll try to talk about this in the later part of the discussion. Second aspect, which can be the point of analysis, is the idea of multilateralism. Now, the institutions which were created in the post-Second World War era sought to maintain the peace and security and sustenance of the unipolar world order, where US was reigning as supreme. That those institutions such as IMF, World Bank, United Nations, NATO, even TPP, the recent example, has seemed to be crumbling, fragmented, and politicized. And we see every second day there is a discussion about what kind of role these institutions are playing to deal with this pandemic. And WHO and UN in specific has been criticized further for their response to pandemic. The UN Security Council has been criticized in particular over the lack of coordinated response to the pandemic, especially regarding the time it took to agree on the resolution demanding a global ceasefire. Although their role has been effective in certain ways, but it has been criticized by many. Much of the criticism of WHO asserts that it failed to exercise global health leadership and instead became a tool of Chinese politics, power, and propaganda. And this critique holds that WHO had the ability to question China's handling of the outbreak in Wuhan so that the organization could better prepare the world for a dangerous disease. But the WHO failed to act decisively. And this has actually led to a lot of questioning over the responsibility of the institution. But when we dig deeper into
you have only a couple of minutes left, so please conclude.
Yeah, I'll just summarize the last 2 points very quickly. Thank you so much. So we know that this is the time when we need to strengthen these institutions rather than questioning them. Now, the third point which I have is the idea about geoeconomics. I'll not dig deeper into it, but just highlight certain points that when we talk about geoeconomics, we know that there has been an impact on the supply chain management, trade and economic relation. And this is actually being defined with the observation over the massive dip in global trade of goods and services due to the trade restrictions. And then the neoliberal economic model, which was already being questioned by many countries, is actually facing the challenges over the period of time, and the COVID has given a catalytic effect to that. And the entire understanding of the international system today is that the single question which is arising to all of us is that should this trend increase? Should we go for more inward-looking economies, or it should be it is the testing time with which we should just have our sustenance going, and then we can see the impact of it. Now, I had to speak about the gated globalization, but then I think due to paucity of time, it's okay to skip this. Now, just the last point, which is that over the geoeconomic, I see that the idea of medical diplomacy can actually provide such an opportunity for China, where the medical assistance which can be provided to further the national goal will have an idea of soft power cemented here, and the medical diplomacy can have some advantage to the countries who are involved in it, especially if we talk about the China and US in the equation. Now, India also have a comparative advantage when we talk about the medical diplomacy, and it is actually because of India's capability to produce generic drugs at the massive level. And last point which I have is that even the geotechnology will have, as a concept, its concrete impact over the post-pandemic times whenever we have to analyze those two hypotheses. Because today we are truly living in the age of apps, and we are actually dependable on the technology. And we also know that this technology itself is a subject of mass surveillance, and which is compromising our privacy and freedom. And we have an example coming from the pre-COVID times, which is the idea of digital authoritarianism of China, and which has also increased the competition between US and China regarding the emerging technologies. And this will, like the consumption pattern which we are analyzing today, will actually lead to uncertainties, which is also leading to uncertainties, and which will be in future also. This will be in flux for some time. So to conclude, I will just say that a case can be made that the power dynamics in the world order will shift towards China. However, a clearer picture will emerge only after a full impact of pandemics come to the floor. And the last point which I have is that we will also have to wait for the US elections to happen. Only after that we will be able to say that the great power rivalry will go in what direction and what not. I know I took a lot of time. Thank you so much, Professor Manish, for giving me 1 extra minute. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vaishali. I think that was a very clear-eyed, very precise presentation, and you really touched upon a broad canvas, which was very important. Obviously, you talked about how the US world, the US-led order was increasingly being challenged by China. I think that's a very fine point. And again, also very importantly, identifying the different variables which were already in place before COVID set in. Like, I mean, obviously the rise of nationalism, protectionism, and most importantly, anti-globalization forces. Obviously, in some sense, the Atmanirbhar Abhiyan can also be seen as some sort of taking, or even the Indian decision to not join RCEP, I think was a very important decision, rethinking about globalization in some manner, in a very important manner, especially the China-led order. And that was a very important point, obviously. And obviously, you again, as I said, as a realist, I mean, completely that the great power politics is going to be around with us, and the US and China ultimately are how is that going to play out is going to be very important in how the world order is really, I mean, in what direction it is heading to. I however, I mean, maybe you could respond later, but this, you talked about China's medical diplomacy, but in fact, what is in vogue now, what the world is actually seeing is China's wolf warrior diplomacy rather than medical diplomacy. You see more of that, which is really unsettling. I mean, Chinese, I mean, neighbors of China, and also, I mean, US elections. I mean, that's a very important point which you raised finally, that US elections are going to play a very important role. But again, also, let's not forget that there is now a bipartisan consensus in the Democrats and the Republicans about the China threat. So in that sense, let's not also assume that the Biden presidency is going to go soft on China, and there might be some, and it is good news for China. I don't think that is really the case. As of now, it looks like that. But anyway, it was excellent. Really enjoyed listening to you. With this, I now request Dr. Sampa Kundu, who is an assistant professor at MIT University. And again, she is speaking on the future of India's sub-regionalism, connecting the missing links. I think it's a very important topic, knowing what happened with SAARC generally, and even, in fact, India was one of the early responders in terms of reaching out first virtual summit with the SAARC nations, with SAARC states, but that didn't really pan out well. So I think she would have very interesting ideas to share with us. So over to you, Sampa.
So thank you to NICE Nepal and Water Policy Center
Right.
India.
Is it your?
I can't still see it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's mine. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
So thank you to NICE Nepal and Water Policy Center India for giving me this excellent opportunity to talk about India's sub-regionalism, the future of India's sub-regionalism, connecting the missing links. So basically, in my presentation, I had thought that what is sub-regionalism and what are the parameters or indicators that we should consider while we are talking about sub-regionalism. So to my mind, the first indicator when we are talking about sub-regionalism, the first indicator that one should look into or one should consider is what is the factor of geography, or why geography is important. The second factor that is important again, and that is common perception and which is related to the identity formation, which is basically a consciousness. The third factor, again related to the first two factors, is what are the common interests, and looking for those common interests, those finding out that common agenda, the cooperation areas, the priority sectors where the countries can cooperate with each other. So when we are talking about the cooperation, the next important thing is what are the common challenges that a region is facing as a region, what the countries are facing while within a region. And then finally, whether the countries do have a conducive environment or conditions to resolve the regional problems together, and also whether they do have any willingness to resolve the regional problems together. So these are some of the factors, some of the important areas that I thought is important while we are talking about India's interest in sub-regionalism and the future of sub-regionalism in South and Southeast Asia. If I can have the next slides, please. Yeah, thank you. So here I had mentioned that what are the guiding principles of India's sub-regionalism and regionalism initiatives. To explain this slide further, the first guiding principle for India would be the neighborhood first policy. And the second thing would be the look is policy or the act is policy, as we have renamed it in the recent past. And of course, we have the Indo-Pacific approach. So India's Indo-Pacific approach is very important in order to understand why India should also foster and nurture the sub-regional cooperation both in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Because when we are talking about Indo-Pacific, this is a very vast geographic concept and also a geostrategic concept. So while we are talking about Indo-Pacific, it is important for us to understand that both SAARC and ASEAN, both South Asia and Southeast Asia, they are also part of India's Indo-Pacific approach. So India cannot actually ignore the interest in South Asia and Southeast Asia and only look for the broader Indo-Pacific approach, because that will not be possible geographically or geostrategically also. So there is a need to have a convergence between India's neighborhood first policy, India's Act East policy, and India's approach towards Indo-Pacific. So the examples that I could find out, and all of us are aware of these examples of India's sub-regionalism and regional initiatives, which include SAARC, ASEAN, BIMSTEC, BCIN, Mekong-Ganga Cooperation, and of course BBIN. So in this slide, I have basically put in one quotation from India's former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, who long ago in 2004 has mentioned.
Sampha, just 1 second. I'm sorry to interrupt. Aruna, I think she has gone ahead with the slides. I think she's on slide 4 right now.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay, the next one actually. Yeah, that's right.
This is right? Third slide.
No, the next one. The next one. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so in this slide, basically, I have quoted India's former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, who in 2004 had mentioned about why neighbors are important. I'm not, recite this entire quotation, but if you can just have a quick look at the slide, you will understand why India put so much of focus on India's neighborhood first policy and why neighbors are so much important for India. And then here in this slide, in 2017, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had actually mentioned that BIMSTEC. Okay, so before I go into the next slide, I should mention to you that here for today's presentation, I have focused on BIMSTEC as India's sub-regional cooperation initiative, because BIMSTEC is one of those sub-regional initiatives where we can find out common linkages between South Asia and Southeast Asia. So BIMSTEC is that unique feature, is that unique sub-regional cooperation that can foster better regional cooperation between these two regions, between South Asia and Southeast Asia. So coming back to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's statement, which he delivered in the year 2017, he mentioned that BIMSTEC not only connects South and Southeast Asia, but also the ecologies of the Great Himalayas and the Bay of Bengal. With shared values, histories, ways of life, and destinies that are interlinked, BIMSTEC represents a common space for peace and development. For India, it is a natural platform to fulfill our key foreign policy priorities of neighborhood first and act east. So here, as I mentioned, that even our leaders, the Minister of External Affairs and the Prime Minister's office, and the policy makers, they are also very much aware, and they are very much conscious about the synergies, the convergence that we can have between neighborhood first policy, Act-East policy, and India's approach towards Indo-Pacific. Coming back to BIMSTEC and what BIMSTEC has achieved so far. So this is a story so far. BIMSTEC was formed in 1997. So BIMSTEC is now 22 years old. In one sense, BIMSTEC is a very young organization, but in other sense, BIMSTEC has already crossed more than 2 decades. BIMSTEC has 5 members from South Asia and 2 members from Southeast Asia. Therefore, it is a bridge between South Asia and Southeast Asia. For India, BIMSTEC is very important because BIMSTEC connects India with Myanmar and Thailand. Therefore, BIMSTEC also offers a lot of potential for Northeast India. Coming to the structural and organizational form of BIMSTEC, those aspects of BIMSTEC, BIMSTEC has already conducted 4 summits: 2004 in Bangkok, in 2008 in New Delhi, 2014 in Myanmar, and 2018 in Kathmandu. BIMSTEC has 14 priority areas, and in 2014, BIMSTEC had opened its secretariat in Dhaka, Bangladesh. BIMSTEC, one of those cooperation areas that we will later talk about with respect to BIMSTEC, one of the very important cooperation area that we could find out from the history of BIMSTEC is a cooperation with Asian Development Bank. Next one, please. So here I'm talking about some of the potentials of BIMSTEC. So BIMSTEC is a sub-region with 1.68 billion people, which roughly amounts to 22% of the world population. It has a combined GDP of US dollar 3.697 trillion. And according to a report published by FICCI, a very recent report, the intra-regional trade potential of BIMSTEC stands at US dollar 250 billion. So these are some of the potential areas of BIMSTEC that we can look for. And now I am talking about what can be expected from BIMSTEC as a sub-regional organization in the coming future. And all these points that I have mentioned in this slide and the next slide, all these aspects, all these features have been mentioned in the Kathmandu Declaration, which was declared after the BIMSTEC summit in 2018 in Kathmandu. So these declarations, the Kathmandu Declaration has these aspects covered, and we are expecting these achievements from BIMSTEC in the near future. So one of those things is cooperation in addressing the criminal matters, which is very important for a sub-region like BIMSTEC, where we have many cross-national and transnational criminal activities happening. Then the second thing is BIMSTEC technology transfer facility. Again, this is very important, especially in the post-COVID-19 era. I think this will gain much more prominence, technology transfer facility. The third would be establishment of diplomatic training institutions. Then we have coastal shipping agreement, BIMSTEC motor vehicle agreement, and they are also working on the BIMSTEC charter. And if news reports are to believe, before the Sri Lankan summit happened, or maybe during the Sri Lankan summit, we'll have the BIMSTEC charter ready with us. Then the next slide, please. So in the Kathmandu Declaration, again, they have mentioned about the BIMSTEC Development Fund. I believe this will again have importance, especially for the post-COVID-19 era. And this has some kind of synergy with ASEAN Development Fund as well, because in the latest ASEAN meeting, they spoke about a COVID Development Fund, post-COVID-19 Development Fund, which will help the ASEAN member countries to fight the post-pandemic challenges. So I believe that if something similar to that can happen within BIMSTEC as well, this will not only enhance the capacity of the BIMSTEC member countries, but this will also link BIMSTEC with ASEAN in a much more comprehensive way. Then the Kathmandu Declaration also spoke about formation of the BIMSTEC permanent committees, centers and entities, etc. And enhancing the institutional capacity of the BIMSTEC Secretariat was also one of the agendas. And they have also spoken about how to improve the visibility of BIMSTEC. Now, this point is very important because when we are talking about people-to-people contact, or when we are talking about cooperation between civil societies, improving the visibility of BIMSTEC is very important, because in South Asia or within the BIMSTEC sub-region, this identity formation, which is linked to the sub-regional cooperation, is something which is still lacking. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So here I'm talking about how to enhance the potential of BIMSTEC. So here I have spoken about 4 particular recommendations, which I have again taken from the Kathmandu Declaration and some of the other BIMSTEC official documents. So in the Kathmandu Declaration, there was one proposal given by Nepal itself, and the proposal was, if we can actually reduce the number of 14 priority areas of BIMSTEC and cut them short to 5 important cooperation pillars. So those 5 important cooperation pillars would be connectivity, trade and investment, people-to-people contact, counter-terrorism and transnational crime, security, and science and technology cooperation. So my takeaway from the Kathmandu Declaration and the Kathmandu Summit of BIMSTEC Kathmandu Summit was, if we can actually reduce the number of priority areas of BIMSTEC, which now stand at 14, then it would actually help the member countries to give more focus to some of the limited areas. But then in those limited areas, there will be more cooperation, there will be more exchanges and sharing of information, etc. So this will actually help the member countries to have more convergence and synergies.
Next. Oh,
Yeah, so in the next slide, I'm again talking about the second recommendation of how to enhance the potential of BIMSTEC, and here I'm talking about the transport and connectivity. So in some of my, in one of my previous slides, I have spoken about how BIMSTEC had connected with Asian Development Bank few years back in order to have a feasibility study. That feasibility study was actually about BIMSTEC transport and infrastructural and logistics study. So that report was published in the year 2014, but after 2014, now we are sitting in 2020, but not much progress has been conducted in this field. Even if we look at the on the ground realities, the projects that were supposed to be implemented by 2020, those projects were not completed on time. So this is, of course, one of the lacunas within BIMSTEC sub-region, as we can all understand. But in the recent years, we can see that there were few official arrangements, some legal arrangements that were done in the arena of transport and connectivity. For example, in the year 2016, BIMSTEC Transport Working Group had its first meeting, and now they are also talking about convergence between BIMSTEC Master Plan on Transport Connectivity and ASEAN Master Plan on Connectivity 2025. So if this kind of cooperation can happen between BIMSTEC and ASEAN, this will obviously enhance the cooperation. This will also enhance the potential of BIMSTEC. So in the next slide, this is my third recommendation, and the third recommendation talks about if we can have more institutional partners of BIMSTEC. Then, if we can have cooperation, more cooperation from Asian Development Bank, if we can have some status for ASEAN as well, and also UNESCO, IORA, World Bank, etc. We can talk about many other organizations, both sub-regional and regional organizations, and some of those other organizations that work either under the umbrella of UN or any other multilateral organizations. If we can have space and place for those organizations within BIMSTEC. It can become observers, they can become a group of consultants, we can work on those official modalities. But if we can have that place for those organizations, it will help BIMSTEC in the sense that BIMSTEC will then be able to benefit from the technological and technical expertise that these organizations already possess. And then in this slide, I have actually spoken about the bottom-up approach. So in South Asia, we have seen that most of the regional organizations, barring few, they actually follow the top-down approach. So in the case of BIMSTEC, if we can adopt a bottom-up approach, this will build up the capacity of the civil societies, the NGOs, the media groups, the cultural groups, the involvement of the academicians and researchers, and the self-help groups. Here I would like to actually give a focus on the self-help groups and how they have contributed not only in India but also in Bangladesh and few other BIMSTEC member countries during the time of COVID-19. So a lot of self-help groups, they have collaborated with the government both at the central level and also at the state level, and they have made tremendous contributions in the fight against COVID-19 in terms of food distribution, in terms of capacity building of the local people, etc. So if we can have a platform of under the umbrella of BIMSTEC, where the women self-help groups from all these countries can come together and they can share their expertise, they can share information and best practices available, this will also help creating a common identity within BIMSTEC. And bottom-up approach and people-to-people contact, all these factors would be important if we need to enhance the potential of BIMSTEC. And finally, if I can just give a little bit of theoretical framework to this entire presentation, here I have primarily spoken about a regional space where geography is important. And we all know that within BIMSTEC, geography plays a very important role because it is Bay of Bengal community that we are talking about. Then in level 2, if we can have a regional complex where we can focus on the friendly competitions and not on the political rivalries. Then at level 3, if we can have a regional society where we can have the legal and formal arrangements in place. And finally, level 4, where we can have a regional community engaging the civil societies. So these 4 parameters, these 4 stages of regional approach is very important if we want to enhance the capacity and potential of BIMSTEC. So with this, I would like to wrap up the presentation. And again, thank you. Thank you to Professor Dawade, and thank you to Dr. Pramod and his team for this excellent opportunity.
Thank you, Sankala. Again, another very excellent presentation in this session. And again, very important, I mean, I was personally looking to learn a lot from you, which eventually I did. Obviously, you talked about factors driving regionalism, and then this whole, how did it come about in India's neighborhood policy? But obviously, you talked about the larger neighborhood first, which talked about South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pacific strategy. But I think very important that you really focused on BIMSTEC. And I think that was very sensible because that is where the real action is happening now. Because SAARC in some ways is in comatose, sort of, if can put it that way, if we can be very crude and blunt about it, but that's the reality now. And what you are saying, in fact, I really liked your point that what we witnessed in SAARC was really a top-down sort of approach, and maybe that is the problem at some stage, and maybe with BIMSTEC taking a bottoms-up approach would indeed be fruitful and beneficial to all the stakeholders. I think that was a very valid suggestion, and obviously the 4-level approach, that's an excellent way of putting it. So thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. With this, I now open up to questions. We have participants joining us. So anybody has questions, please raise your hand and please introduce yourself and shoot your question. But obviously, which direction you are shooting, let us know. Everyone is in agreement with all the points made by the speakers, it seems. Okay, let's do one thing. Sampa, you have questions for the panelists? Please go ahead.
Me? Okay.
Till others decide, we can start.
I had a
with
couple
you.
of questions actually.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please, yeah.
Sampa wanted to go first.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please.
So I had comments and questions for Nausheen's presentation and for Sampa's presentation. So Nausheen's presentation was very interesting, especially the realistic take of the nation state not going anywhere. But on multilateralism, I thought there was undue pessimism. I feel one of the takeaways from the pandemic has been the need or the recognition by most countries for the need to work together. And while of course the US has continued with its unilateral approach, but we see many other countries like the European Union, for example, recently has come very close to strengthening its fiscal union. They have issued COVID bonds, which would be used to finance the pandemic, which was unthinkable before. And I think France and Germany has been working together to see how the European Commission specifically as an institution can actually provide financing to help the weaker member states. Of course, the world is beyond Europe and there are many other examples. And so I think that multilateralism, at least at a conceptual level, there has been a recognition in the pandemic for the need to work together. Yes, as for Sampa, your presentation on BIMSTEC, I used to actually work in the Indian Ministry of External Affairs before I came here. And one of the things which we felt, at least I felt there, was that the Secretariat of BIMSTEC is what needs attention. It has too few people and you can give it all the projects you want, but if there's nobody in the Secretariat to really implement those, then it would be adding more burden on a weak institution. So of course, this is my personal view, but I felt that the Secretariat needs more money, more people specifically. Yeah. So I think that is a very specific thing which might help take this forward as well, which was a comment from my side.
Thanks, Abdul. We have one more question in the chat box, which has come from YouTube. And maybe one of you could answer that, that India has failed to take SAARC and BIMSTEC forward. The question is, can India emerge as regional or global power without the support of strong regional framework and order? So any one of you or all of you could decide to answer this. But someone can begin by answering. It's Nausheen and Sampa. So over to you, Nausheen.
Well, on multilateralism, yes, multilateralism is important, and you see the world is moving towards multipolarity that we have been hearing since the end of the Cold War. But you see, this has not really been in picture, and all the power centers that are emerging need to align themselves with the major power. And I see in the coming days major power dictating the political features at regional level as well. So you see, Europe itself is facing crisis, specifically after the Brexit. We were anticipating more changes in Europe as far as this regional power is concerned. But then this didn't happen. Every region, if we take the micro level analysis, seems to be in crisis. So multipolarity is taking shape, but that is in alliance with one of the major powers. And you see, I also have serious doubt on the China's rise as the global power, as one of the global power, or superseding the American power in near future. Because you see, in terms of economics, China is doing very well, but in terms of military capabilities, in terms of other power structures, in terms of the kind of politics that supports the role of regional power, China is lagging far behind. So you see, in the coming decade, I do not see China really superseding United States power, but working in alliance. Russia, for example, and Russia is in contest with the United States. I think it will follow the revenge policy. So you see, multipolarity in that context has not been really very promising. And you see, you talked about the 1930s depression, and still we see the recession in the world. So you see, multipolarity or the unipolarity, bipolarity requires a support system. It requires to give support to the countries within the region, and that has not been in picture. So that is my concern, why I see the politics, more divisions in politics and more aggravating situation in the future. What Manish said about the India taking SAARC further, and whether it can establish its major power role without taking the regional countries into account, I think no. And you see, I see many factors that many factors emerging right now that may propel um, India to resolve its conflict with the regional state. One important factor is this rise of China in the region. You see, China is welcomed by the other states in the region because they think that they cannot unilaterally deal with India. And India considers Chinese growing influence in the region as the intervention of its sphere of influence. So if India resolves its conflict with the neighboring state, activates SAARC, because you see SAARC is in coma because of this India-Pakistan rivalry mainly, and some of the other conflicts impact on SAARC's proceedings. So that is important. Other promising factor that I see from the regional cooperation perspective is the role of extra-regional power. And you see, this time, for the first time, a common enemy factor is emerging for the outside power and the inner power, China. So you see, United States is also to contain China, China's rise in the global power position, and for India to maintain its major power role, to manifest its major power role, it is important to counter the Chinese influence sphere in the region. And this, you see, since China is not trusted in India, United States play mediatory role between India and Pakistan, and this could help make the regional situation better. So this, I think, is very important factor that we must try to capitalize on. And I'm not talking from the policy making perspective, especially in Pakistan, but this, as a scholar, I feel that the new changes that are taking place in the region requires rethink in strategic policies of the state. So if India is to maintain its major power, it's to sustain its power position, it is to address the crisis within the region. That's my take on this situation.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the questions. Yeah, I totally agree with Abdul that the way BIMSTEC Secretariat was, you know, founded, and then the way it was functioning, there were many loopholes and many drawbacks when it comes to the taking up of projects or implementation of projects. There were lack of coordination, etc. The first thing that we all know that the organization was set up in the year 1997, but it took so many years for it to come up with a permanent secretariat. And then there were also, debates that whether it should be in Sri Lanka or whether it should be in Dhaka. So a lot of things had happened, but this is not an exceptional case, because we all know that what had happened within BRICS as well. So let's not forget that story. But even having said all these things, I do agree that yes, enhancement of BIMSTEC Secretariat and increasing its empowering the secretariat so that it can take up few projects, it can take up the decision making process, etc. That should be in our mind, that should be in the minds of the policy makers. What was the other question? Alternative to SARC, right?
No, it was from YouTube that India has failed to take SARC and BIMSTEC forward. So can India emerge as a regional or global power without support of strong regional framework in order?
Okay. So I think though I am one of the advocates of BIMSTEC, I have been working on BIMSTEC for so long, but I have a little doubt whether BIMSTEC can be an alternative to SARC, because when BIMSTEC was initiated, it was clearly mentioned that it will not work as an alternative neither to ASEAN nor to SARC, because the founding members, at that point in time, they were quite clear that BIMSTEC will work or it will try to foster connectivity, it will try to foster cooperation between the member countries, between the 5 member countries from South Asia and 2 from Southeast Asia. So I do have a doubt that whether BIMSTEC would be working as an alternative to SARC. But then, yes, given the current geopolitical tension in South Asia, given the political rivalries between India and Pakistan, this enthusiasm towards BIMSTEC from the Indian side, from the Indian point of view, is totally understood. And this enthusiasm has been witnessed as far as BIMSTEC is concerned ever since the Uri attack had happened and BRICS BIMSTEC summit was held in Goa. So yes, to some extent, probably BIMSTEC will uphold the enthusiasm from India's point of view towards sub-regionalism, but again, it will probably not be an alternative to SARC, because of course Pakistan and Afghanistan are not part of BIMSTEC. So it will be difficult to assume that BIMSTEC becoming alternative to SARC. Yeah, that's my.
Question to respond to the YouTube question again. Any one of you or both of you? The same about, can India really become a regional or global power without a strong regional framework?
Yeah, Vaishali, please. No.
Please unmute yourself.
I just have a small observation for letting first. I just have a small observation about when we talk about the regional setup and when we talk about the organizations, the setup like SARC and BIMSTEC. We see that more than the regional leader, India is, it's its personal opinion, it is completely depending upon my own observation of India at the global level, that instead of focusing on the more strong regional framework, India's, we have a lot of foreign policies signaling towards the fact that India will have its own regional orientation, and with this current government, the government is trying to focus both the ways, internationally and regionally. But then the more focus is towards the global status rather than the regional. And certainly, BIMSTEC has been seen as an alternative to the SARC. Hello. Yes.
I'm sorry, Vishali, you are not audible.
Okay. Am I audible to everyone else?
Yeah, I could hear you.
If anyone can respond.
I
Okay.
could hear
Okay. Thank you so much. So I was just maintaining a point that more than the regional orientation, India is having a global orientation these days. Though it can be a point of dispute for so many scholars that this is not how it is, because the recent policies have been directed towards the regional orientation also, and India had tried to improve its ties with the neighbors and with the rest of the countries who are geographically close to the country. But then it is when we try to analyze the foreign policies and the concrete steps taken, we must understand that the focus has been, and it should be, on the global arena per se. And certainly when we talk about the BIMSTEC and SARC, we know that SARC has been a kind of narrative which is now fading away from the discussion in the diplomatic corridors of India. And then BIMSTEC has been a focus for a good time as an alternative to the SARC. But today, if it is up to my opinion, I would say that neither of them is the focus. I know it is a very strong point, but I have my own reasons for it. So thank you so much. And Professor Manish, if I can respond to the question which has been posed from the Facebook viewer and continue. Okay, thank you. So as I said in my presentation also, the question is that what kind of world order do you foresee in post-COVID-19 times? China dominated or multipolar world or no change? So I would say it is, as I have said in my presentation while concluding also, that it is too early to give any remark to the international world order, as it was very difficult earlier. And we have seen it isn't that the entire international order is in transition. We can't say it is unipolar. It has now shifted to unipolar, to bipolar, or to multipolar. But certainly the trend is emerging as it is going to be a sort of bipolar, as if I have to analyze on the 4 different variables which I have posed on the basis of geoeconomics, geostrategy, and then multilateralism and certain other aspects, then it is certainly going to be a bipolar. But as Professor Manish has also mentioned, that the entire discussion is actually pending. And then when we see the elections happening in these in major country, in US particularly, then, and if the COVID ends, which is not going to end any soon, as we all know, then only we can analyze. But these are the parameters with which we can continue the discussion for a good time, for a good long time, and then we can have our own analysis. But to me, certainly, I cannot argue for a concrete projection that this is how it is going to be. It is going to be in transition for a good time. But as I can see on the basis of the parameters which I have posed, that it is going to be probably the China will dominate if there is a turmoil which we are seeing today in the US domestic politics. Thank you.
Just a couple of quick points on the question which was posed to me. So I think it's a very important and straightforward question whether India can emerge as a regional or global power without the support of a strong regional framework. If you look at the other great powers in history, the United States has the Americas as its sphere of influence, which it settled through the Monroe Doctrine and is now enforced through the Organization of American States, which is headquartered in Washington. Russia had the the CIS of mostly Central Asian countries. The European colonizing powers now have the EU. So we do see that there seems to be a strong logic for geographical regional integration for all of the great powers before us. And I think there is a good reasoning for that. So the short answer to that question would be yes. I think there's no escaping strong South Asian regional integration either through SARC or BIMSTEC.
We have a last question for okay, Sampa, there's one question for you. I think you have partly answered that already. That SARC is in coma and India is pushing BIMSTEC. Okay, but there's some an additional question here. As an alternative, claiming Pakistan as a troublemaker. But very important, if BIMSTEC fails to succeed, would it be wise to cause India for the failure of both SARC and BIMSTEC?
Okay. I was somehow expecting this question. See, when it comes to regional cooperation or any regional initiatives, I don't think it is wise to cause any particular member country for the failure of that, entire organization or cooperation, because obviously this is not a one-member driven organization. Neither SARC was one-member driven nor BIMSTEC is one-member driven, right? So within BIMSTEC also we have many other countries, and it is a very good sign that most of the member countries of BIMSTEC, all of them have taken interest in BIMSTEC. Say for example, Thailand was very interested in the improvement of BIMSTEC, in the activities of BIMSTEC till the time BIMSTEC Secretariat was happening, was placed. It was Thailand that was coordinating all the activities of BIMSTEC from its Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In fact, BIMSTEC was initiated in Bangkok. The first summit was conducted in Bangkok. Similarly, Sri Lanka was also very enthusiastic about BIMSTEC. So I really don't think that it would be wise or it would be reasonable to cause India or to make India responsible if BIMSTEC fails to succeed. And I think there was another question that whether BIMSTEC could be seen as countering China's BRI. Again, I have my serious reservations because India, if we see Indian Ministry of External Affairs, their statements and speeches of the leaders, nowhere in those statements or speeches they have mentioned that they want to counter China through any regional cooperation initiatives or any formal arrangements. If we take the example of Quad also, in quadrilateral security dialogue, they have been very cautious about it, that they should not mention anything like countering China's BRI. On the other hand, we have initiatives like Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. I think some speakers in the last panel, one speaker in the last panel, she was talking about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. And then we also have Blue Dot Network, which is advocated by USA. So these initiatives are here, which will promote some kind of infrastructural cooperation and connectivity projects, not only in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, but also in Africa. But let's not look at these initiatives from the point of view of countering China only, because there will be many other serious geopolitical and geostrategic considerations while we are talking about these projects. For example, developmental diplomacy is one of the key words in contemporary diplomacy now. So we need to look into all these factors rather than only focusing on, countering Chinese measures and all. So yeah, that was my point.
Yeah, great. I think I don't see any questions, but any participant would have questions. Please unmute yourself and okay, yeah.
Manish, I
Now
do
she.
not have, yes, thank you, Manish. I do not have a question, I just have a comment. Vishali, if I understood you correctly, you said that India should be looking at the major power role at the global level, not at the regional level, right? Is this what you said?
Orientation is that. Orientation
Orientation is
there.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree to this. But you see, there is a dilemma of power politics. And the dilemma is that the country which is to be the global power needs to be uncontested regional power, right? So you see, India is to make, certainly. So for that reason, you see, India needs to, you see, amend its relations with the neighboring state. Because I was also reading one of the comments, which is understood very well, that Pakistan is a troublemaker, that is not because of which SAARC is not, you see, working properly. But you see, there were, I see all these states in the region following the realist discourse. And if we see the suspension of SAARC's meeting, it has been on the because of the Nepal situation. It has been because of the Afghanistan situation at times. And then you see this China factor is very important. So you see, if India is to contest China in the region, is to contain its sphere of influence in the region, it has to deal with this BRI as well. So either India becomes part of the BRI project, or this BRI project is rolled back. So you see, this is the dilemma. And you see, if we go by the negotiations that India was having in the United Nations Security Council for its permanent membership role, you see, these are the factors I think that can be negotiated well in the region to settle the regional conflicts. For example, just for this, I think that what if we say that Pakistan would support India's role in the United Nations Security Council if the territorial disputes are settled? So you see, something like this can be discussed, and SAARC is the important forum for it. Bilateral mechanisms are important. And you see, Afghanistan factor is very important. While we see how this global power or major power will be rising from that area. And I think this coronavirus pandemic has given us a wonderful opportunity to discuss this openly that otherwise was not possible. So you see, this connectivity among scholars at this level should be an exploiting point to search what modalities, what frameworks can be made to resolve the conflicts. And we discuss what possible solutions may be of that conflict. Because if we go by the state's position, we are stuck in the same situation that we are in. So some of my crude thoughts.
So I think we call it a close. So thank you all, speakers for all your terrific presentations. I think, and again, patiently answering to questions asked here, questions from YouTube and Facebook. So I really thank, and I really enjoyed all the presentations, learned a lot, and looking forward to more interactions in the future. So with this, I think back over to the host.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir.
Yes,
It was a very thought-provoking session, and I really thank you, everyone, distinguished chair speakers, ladies and gentlemen. As we came to end of this session, it is my great honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NICE and Water Policy Center. I would like to express our gratitude and sincere thanks to Mr. Manish Dabade uh, for accepting our request to chair this session. Our sincere thanks goes to all the speakers for delivering such a comprehensive and insightful presentations. We are honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, expert, academic, media, and different organizations. Last but not the least, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. We are truly honored to have you all with us this morning and hope to stay connect with us in as future. I request all you please kindly join us for the next session. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.